In a world of complex and overwhelming challenges, the Inspirational Insights podcast provides a shift in perspective. Dive into the minds of brilliant thinkers, creatives, and edge-riding leaders who have adapted their thinking and leadership practices to match today's perplexing challenges. Your host, Donna Jones, leads captivating conversations with trailblazers from diverse fields who have transcended tough and complex conditions to contribute to a healthier world. Can we collectively break old habits to reinvent the human work-earth relationship and support the vitality and diversity of all life? Harnessing agility, embracing possibilities. Welcome to the journey.
Companies around the world have a tendency to fall into rut, and they have a great deal of pressure to conform. And with that comes insights left on the periphery and also a lot of innovation. With me today is Paul McCarthy, and we are talking about disruptive leadership. We're talking about disruption, period, because that's where companies can grow. COVID witnessed a fast return, a fast pedal backward to the familiar as quickly as possible, so people could find certainty again, and that missed a bunch of moments. So we're here to talk about that. Paul, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Donna. Really nice to be here. I know we were going backstage about some of our mutual interest and some key words that came up in our conversation. So yeah, really just excited to see where this unfolds.
Paul's written a bunch of stuff, but one of the most recent books is The Fired Leader, which is an intriguing concept on its own. Talk about that, please.
Yeah, I started with the end in mind. And I didn't know that I was starting with the end in mind when I wrote The Fired Leader, Reinventing the Future of Leadership, because I just had this idea from my experiences as a leader and also developing leaders that something wasn't working in the way that we were preparing our organizations and our leaders for a future to navigate ongoing disruption. It's all come out to the world now, and it's been 5 years in the making, Donna. And it's the first book of 3, but ironically, it's where I see the future of leadership heading. So it's my calling part and my end game that basically shows how we'll need a different kind of leader to help our organizations be future ready. And that this kind of leader has up until now been marginalized or stigmatized, discredited, or exercised from the organization for having the qualities that are not understood by the organizations and those that they work with. And that's what the book in a nutshell is about showing what is the challenge today with our approaches to leadership, showing how we need a different approach going forward, and helping the reader to figure out how to make that a reality.
Interesting. Now, to write a book called The Fired Leader, I would suggest you've been fired at some point.
Yeah.
I totally connect with this topic because when you think differently, it's not welcome in a world that values conformity above adaptive capacity, above adjusting to what's going on, above shifting, about anything. So I get this, and having spent 9 years on the road because of it, I very much appreciate the mission you're on. What happened that brought you to this place of really appreciating the value of thinking differently, of holding the line around not just to let your boundaries go and step into whatever they want you to conform to, except you can't breathe after that? How did you get here?
Yeah, you're very astute. I was indeed fired. I was fired 4 times from a range of senior and executive leadership roles. 2 big 4 consulting firms, a boutique consulting firm, and a startup that I was part of, actually starting up. I was fired, Donna, because I demonstrated the leadership qualities that I was hired. And so what do I mean by that? I talk about this all over the world and talked about this so many times that it's almost second nature to me. I always appreciate people hear this story for the first time. It's polarizing. We don't really like to talk about firing leaders. We don't like to talk about the topic in general. We keep that topic hidden under the stairs. I was recruited over 6 to 9 interviews on average with various places I'd worked. And I was asked to demonstrate certain leadership qualities as part of that recruitment process. So showing who and what I was and how I worked as a leader all the way through these processes was a consistent for me. I get into working in the leadership role And as soon as I start to demonstrate the leadership qualities that I was being recruited for, I would get the proverbial slap on the wrist. You mentioned just a few moments ago, thinking differently gets us into trouble. I was recruited to think differently. I was in all of the organizations that I was fired from. I was recruited to bring them into new markets, to establish new relationships by using different methods, different approaches, challenge what we call the status quo. And I was doing that well before it became like 6 million hits on Google when you search for challenge the status quo right now. I was genuinely brought on to help organizations do something differently. And as soon as I started to do that, I would later in my book call it that I would step on ego-based leadership landmines. And so politics, silos, turf wars, every kind of conceivable political challenge in an organization, I would expose. And it wouldn't be me exposing it intentionally. I would expose it by being what I was recruited to be. I talked about this in another podcast recently. Many people update their resumes when they're fired, and we all do it, and we gloss it over. And I didn't do that. I became really curious about the systems and the processes and the structures, and whether or not the way that we identified, recruited, onboarded, and developed leaders was fit for the future. And so that's what started my path down this road, which has, up until relatively recently, been quite a lonely road because it's a taboo subject. And very few people wanted to really rock the boat because the leadership development industry, well, you all know these figures, I'm sure by now, because I've been talking about them for 5 years. We spend about 400 billion every year developing leaders, and only 14% of people who buy that leadership development thinks that it works. So I began asking really challenging questions, and then no one could answer those questions. So I delved deeper. Nobody could answer those questions. And all of a sudden, I'm taking on the learning and development of the leadership industry by having these questions that we so need, and yet we haven't created the conditions to have, Lorna. So my story is quite simple, really. I was fired for demonstrating what I was asked to demonstrate. I then got curious because I thought my job is to develop leaders as well as a consultant. So I was looking at what was coming on the horizon and what were the trends in the future of leadership. And I started to notice this disconnect that no one was talking about. And that was the hypothesis which led to the book, The Fired Leader, which is, I wonder if we're firing the leaders with the leadership qualities that we need to navigate ongoing disruption. It was a simple yes or no answer. And it's consumed 5 years of my life. Quite unintentionally. I must stress them. I am an accidental thought leader. I didn't want any of it. I played the part in the system. I knew that there was something wrong. It was that niggling feeling that we all have, but I wanted to be the leader who fitted in. I had the corner office. I had all of those achievements that you would look at, and I couldn't fit in. And I couldn't fit in because I was not embraced for who I was with the leadership qualities that I was told that they wanted to be demonstrated. So that's why I'm sitting here and talking to people like you and others and everything else I've been doing for the last 5 years.
I so relate to this, and I'm really grateful to be having this conversation. It takes me back to two things. One, I had an interview with Fred Simon, who was executive with Ford back in the award-winning Lincoln Ford Navigator project. And he was told by the organization, go out and do something, go and innovate. He and his team, which included Nixon, went out and did that and got a huge backlash because they changed where the engineers would flag problems from back end to as we go, let's flag it. It's the least expensive place to make a change. So he did that, and the kickback was huge. It was, what are you doing? The subtext was innovate, but don't change anything. And I think that's quite common in a lot of organizations, and why a lot of organizations have to put an innovation cell elsewhere. They have to protect them from the conformity of the rest of the organization. So that's the one thought. The systemic view of there's all these systems and processes running underneath. And instead of recognizing that we're shaking those up, and that's what's surfacing and blasting people for surfacing them, that's information. It's context. It's an understanding that the design of the organization is programmed for stability, not creativity or adaptive ability. That's the one dimension. The other one is in the first podcast I had, which I finished in 2016, I interviewed Gary Klein, who just finished coming out with the book, Seeing What Others Don't. When you go in with a sensing frame, and that's who you are, you sense things, there's all these insights that are sitting on the edge. They're not front and center, they're on the edge. And the organization that's running on ruts, any kind of disruption causes them, or anything that's a little bit different causes them to discount that. Let's get that out of the way because it's challenging us and we don't want to. But that's where the insights are. And insights are valuable because they're both risk mitigation and also innovation. That conversation really validates what you're saying. It says, got a lot of information inside this organization. How do we spot it and not let the system sabotage, not let our underlying processes and thinking that are attached to those processes sabotage it?
You said a lot of great pieces there. And one of the words that sticks out to me is the word systemic. When I started asking those questions, Dora, I started asking the uncomfortable questions, which were, are our systems and processes and structures complicit in the systemic dysfunction and institutional ineffectiveness? And I would go deeper into looking at the way that we structured our organizations and started to ask whether those structures, the organizational design, were relevant for the future. And so not just the approach to talent and decision-making and decision rights, but the actual way that people worked and interacted with one another. Because to your point from the Gary Klein comment around insights are valuable and those insights are on the edges. And it tends to be the talent, the leaders that are misunderstood, who have those innovative ideas, but they're not seen, they're not valued. And so they're labeled, because it's easier to label them troublemakers and rebels, rather than you've got your next hidden gem in the organization. What I wanted to do was to set out and answer that question. Are we firing leaders with those qualities needed? The other thing I started to do was a tremendous amount of research over the last 5 years. So this isn't just some guy that is bitter for being fired from 4 organizations, because to the outside, literal level thinker, I would be the common denominator because I got fired 4 times. And so I agree. And that's where my story differs from everyone else's, because I delved deeper to ask the questions that no one was asking, or if they did, they were asking them behind closed doors. As part of this research, I wanted to basically find out if there was a theme in the world around leaders who had disruptive leadership capabilities. And it seems quite relevant to mention it here, because one of the pieces of research I found was this report called the Global Innovation Index. Every year, it produces a report that shows the top performing countries and the lowest performing countries in terms of their ability to innovate. It measures every year a country's ability to innovate and directly correlates that with the amount of GDP that it produces. And so one of the things that is unequivocally concluded is that the ability of a country to innovate and grow its economy is directly linked to how effective organizations are at identifying, cultivating, and embracing talent who have disruptive quality. So when I do workshops on this and keynotes, I just pause at this point because I want to get people to really absorb what I just said. Our future ability to be innovative as a world relies on the ability to see the leaders who have disruptive qualities differently. And that can blow some people's minds. What's underpinning this, Donna, is the fact that we still see the word disruption or disruptive as a negative.
Yeah.
And we cannot seem or will not seem to disassociate from the negative connotations that the word conjures up in us. I'm on a mission to do that. And I'm on a mission to shift the narrative inside organizations about how they look at leaders and general talent, not just leaders, but across the talent spectrum who have these kinds of quality. So I think your 2 points that you raise are spot on. It's a systemic thing. And also those insights from people around the edges that are not being seen, they are your future. They are the organization's greatest assets if you'll allow them to be.
One of the things I appreciate about what you just shared is that in life, there'll be some pattern. This is the way I frame it. I'm planning to eat Chinese food tonight, but I end up with Italian every time. In other words, you want to do something different, but no, here you are again. I use 3 as my number. When 3 things show up in my life that are either pleasant or unpleasant, it's a signal to step back and say, what's going on here? And that's where you separate yourself from the confusion of being fired 3 times or 4 times, however many times it is, to going, what's really going on here? Because that deeper dive into sense making that I think organizations really need to do right now. It's the leadership opportunity to say, what are we repeating? What are we running reruns on? Just repeating the same shows over and over again and not really moving anywhere with it.
Yeah. It's interesting. You talk about when 3 things surface. And I think in relation to what we're talking about here, what I would invite organizations to do to use that mechanism that you've just outlined is the 3 things that I see surfacing in organizations to show that they need a different approach to the way they do things today is things like engagement levels, low levels of engagement. Gallup, I think, estimated in 2023, just 23% of people are engaged at work. And that we know leads to the $8.9 trillion that is now in global disengagement of leaders and talent across the organization.
Wow.
So that's the first thing that surfaces. The second thing is levels of turnover that then come from that disengagement. In other podcasts, we talked about quiet quitting. We talked about the effects of that. But essentially what I try and get organizations to do is to quantify how much it's costing them right now when leaders leave their organization, either voluntarily because they're disengaged or involuntarily because they're misunderstood, right? And now let me just throw a stat out there that it costs between 213 and 400% of a leader's base salary to replace that leader.
Wow.
That's only one financial cost. What about medical, pension, litigation costs? What about non-financial? Impact on the team left behind, the impact of the client and the reputation with the work that's been done. And what about future turnover levels of that leader's team that they leave behind? And that leads to the third thing, which is productivity. Productivity starts to do. So if you're listening to this from an organization and you want to understand the impact that not having the right caliber and type of leader for the future is going to have, those are the 3 things I would ask you to do to quantify your engagement levels, your turnover levels, and your productivity levels. You'll be able to put a number to them. And that in itself is scary.
It is. I wrote Decision Making for Dummies. So the logic is that if you have the information, you make the decision. That's not what happens. If they don't feel it, they don't do it. And all the logic and the talk around, we need higher levels of productivity. We really want them. But we don't want neurodiverse people in our organizations, even though they will give us higher levels of productivity, but they don't fit. So they shake us up. And I think, okay, you can't have it 2 ways. You can't say, look, we want higher levels of productivity, but we're going to exclude the people that can provide them. I think that makes no sense to me.
No.
This is where this disruption, one has to encourage it so that you can juggle that thinking up a bit, shake it up, and allow for growth. And it's almost like personal growth for organizations. Can we bring in some growth so that we can embrace different views, different ways of seeing things, and adapt who we are to embrace more talent?
Yeah, it's interesting you say that you have the information. The assumption is that you'll make the decision. How many leaders and executives have we probably worked with between us where that's been the case? All the data points are there and no decisions made. I don't want to be the bearer of bad news here, but there will come a point, and there is coming a point where organizations are carrying a lot of dead weight. What I mean by that is employees, leaders are doing the bare minimum, again, referred to as quiet quitting, but I also have an understanding of quiet quitting as a concept that it's really the outpouring of the manifesting of deeply ingrained toxicity caused by systemic and institutional dysfunction. But the point remains, I think, if you're at the coalface of an organization in HR, hiring managers, are absolutely integral to this conversation about how do we get changes in decisions up the line in the organization. One of the things you mentioned was neurodivergence. That's an increasing topic that a lot of people are talking about. One of the things that's little known though, and I talk about this in one of my own podcast episodes, but the fastest growing bias in the HR industry is what they call cognitive diversity bias. Quite simply, that is a bias against people who think differently than others. So when you think about the neurodivergent, they do think differently than perhaps a lot of their colleagues. When you think about a leader who has disruptive leadership capability, they think differently than their leader peers. And so hiring managers really have and can be a gateway to the caliber and the kinds of leaders that are entering the organization. Because if that's not the case, what we're going to continue getting is what we've always got. And so nothing will change. That in itself becomes a data point. Talent will work with their feet. Retaining talent is a big issue these days, especially since the pandemic, and especially with more remote working, hybrid working environments, and more changes coming in the work. Simply put, unless you're living under a rock and you're in a leadership and a decision-making position, you're not going to be able to avoid not making a decision going forward.
Yeah, so many thoughts there are running through my mind right now, as you can well imagine. To me, it's also the opportunity to step back and ask, what's really motivating my response here? What is it about my thinking that is running smack dab or reacting negatively to this idea of neurodivergence, whatever it happens to be? And the biases are many. Age is one. Thinking differently is another.
Yeah.
Change, I thought, my gosh, how can that be? Because if you don't change and adapt, you just keep increasing your risk. If you're a company and if you're an individual, you can increase your stress. That's what you want, then okay, go for that. But if it's not what you want, then you have to every now and again step off the wheel, the little gerbil wheel of running around in routine, and say, what do I need to be doing differently here? And I think a lot of what we're also seeing is that when change comes along and there's resistance to change, it's saying, I don't have the confidence to move through this. I feel anxious about it because I don't trust that I can do it. And so that's a really deep inner decision that says, what if I trust? What if I trust that as an organization, we can work with disruptive events, whether it's disruptive thinking or a particular event that takes place like a COVID event. And we treat it as an opportunity to strengthen our resilience, build confidence on a cohesive level, not just individually, but cohesively, and treat it as a different opportunity. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. It's interesting when you say reframing what's happening to see it as an opportunity. One of the things I'm reminded of is some of the research that I have reviewed as part of my work. And this particular piece was by Korn Ferry. And Korn Ferry is one of the largest leadership consulting firms in the world. Pre-pandemic, actually, 2019, they put out a piece of research called the Self-Disruptive Leader. They talk at quite a high level about some of the defining features of what they call self-disruptive leader. One of the things that comes out is these leaders see opportunities to transform, and they are what we call adaptive change makers. In the context of what you've just said around when we come to an event that requires us to shift our thinking or change in some way, the usual response is fear-based. We don't want to lose something. We don't want to venture down a path because the old way now is no longer, or we're transitioning from something. That's a very basic human reaction. That's a natural reaction. I'm an anthropologist by background as well. I studied anthropology at university. So I'm fascinated by human culture and why we do the things we do, which is what led me into a career in consulting as well. And so one of the things I've seen with respect to my work and also what you're saying around this, why do people react negatively? It's almost a reluctant to do the work to self-reflect. So where does that come from? Perhaps a lack of self-awareness. For me, what I do when I work with clients is I always find out where they are on a scale? How open are they to looking at themselves differently? If they're not, then there's no point working with clients who just want to tick a box. It's a bumper sticker approach to change, because the real opportunity to transform is when we do that inner work. I'm reading a book at the moment, which it is about spirituality, but one of the things it talks about, which actually really gets me quite interested in the conversation around transformation from a different perspective, because I've been helping clients transform for my entire career. And we always assume that transformation is about evolving, moving something forward. But actually, it's about unlearning. It's about unlearning a way of behavior, a way of seeing something, a mindset, a philosophy, so that you can relearn another and then take that out further. In the context of what we're talking about here, I think people that react negatively, I would encourage them to ask themselves those questions. You know, what's coming up for them when I react this way? What am I reluctant to let go of? What do I need to unlearn? Before they even venture out and talk about this with their organization. It's an inner piece of work, Donna, that unfortunately not everyone is going to be open to doing.
Everyone's going to have their own timing on that, which I appreciate. That in the mid 2000s, when I was doing all this work to try and elevate the level of leadership to handling disruptive events like we're talking about today, it was very much around a pulse. It was an epiphany, or maybe you read a book and all of a sudden it shifts your perspective on things. I used to think back and wonder, how do other people stay no growth? How do they do that? Because I've never been able to do that. It's not ingrained in my way of being. And then I realized everybody at some point is going to have an event, whether it's the loss of a loved one or something that sort of shakes up the patterns that you live life on. And it gives you that place to decide, well, who do I want to be? What if? And it's dissimilar from those big decisions, the crux of the decision. You've been through 4 firings or whatever disrupt type of events that had a pattern to them. When you spot that, you go, okay, that's interesting. Now I can explore what that's about. And then you use that to move forward from. I think the times where reflection, and I've said this lots of times now, but reflection is probably one of the most powerful leadership practices we have available to us, whether it's individually or organizationally, just to say, what are we doing over and over again out of habit? What am I doing out of habit that thanks to the disruption, I now can see and I can do something. I can make a choice. I can make an intentional and conscious choice with it.
I think it's that openness in terms of the word disruption and disruptive events. I think it's that openness to seeing disruptive events in a different light. I read some of Bob Proctor's work, and some of Bob Proctor talked about there's 2 routes that we change our behavior through. One is by choice, and the other is that cataclysmic event. If someone's listening to this in an organization and wondering, well, what can that cataclysmic event be? I take them back to what we talked about earlier, which is your turnover, productivity, and your ability to engage people. Once those things start to eat away at the culture, the fabric, the very DNA of your organization, you've got a problem, because by the time you notice, it's generally too late. And so the reflection, but again, that reflection piece, unless it's done in parallel or up front, it's almost like I'm just trying to think of the analogy, but the horse is bolted from the stable at that point. And now we're in cleanup mode. And so generally when people are in cleanup mode, they're looking for someone to blame. And that means they're looking outward again. They're not looking at the source, because it's from the source, like my own firings, right? I look into myself. Well, what was it about me? I was asked to challenge. I did that. I was asked to come up with new ideas. I did that. I gained trust and built trust quickly. That wasn't appreciated by some people that are ego-based leaders. I genuinely had the purpose of the organization at my core. Well, a lot of people these days are just in it for the pay. And so when you go that extra mile because you just believe in the purpose of something, you have a delta that is created between the group thing and you. So yeah, all of those things to me, Dora, they provided necessary data point from which I could do more reflection. And from that reflection came some hypothesis and then deeper and deeper work. It's not easy. This is not easy to do. I've yet to meet or see any leadership program out there that actually does the deep work needed in the reflection space as a leader. Because I agree with you. I think the ability to reflect is a really important attribute as a leader.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm aware of a company that had during the COVID pandemic, all their employees were remote and their productivity went up. So when COVID diminished and it was no longer a threat, immediately the order was come back into the office. Now that's not a decision grounded in we need higher productivity. They already had that. That was a decision grounded in I need to have control or see where people are. At least if I sense into that's the image that comes up. And that's a different matter. It reminds me, because it's been quite obvious for quite a while now, that I think we're shifting our leadership stance from controlling our outer world into being in control of ourselves and working with our inner world in a more intentional and direct way. I ride horses over 40 years or so. One thing they taught me is that it's never their fault. It's always something that's happened or you're doing things wrong. You can go on YouTube and find horses that have jumped the whole ring without their rider and done an exceptional, a better job of it than they might have with the rider on. It's looking at yourself first. That's the default. And in that default is the opportunity to say, okay, what is it in me that's either creating this or shaping it? What am I getting here? And I know it took me forever to understand the feedback I was getting from the outer world because I didn't know what questions to ask. I just didn't know what is that practice made of? But I think that's the practice of today.
Yeah. And I think if I was wrapping a bow around what you just said there, what I'm hearing is we now are in a place where we're raising the consciousness of leadership and we are elevating the role of leaders for the future. And every practitioner is doing it in their own different ways, of course. And I think there's a general tidal increase. What's that quote where the tide is lifting all boats to a new plane? And one of the things you just said sparked the word hypocrisy for me, because they talked about productivity and work location. Pre-pandemic, there was very much an office-driven culture with draconian approaches to leadership. To me and the research and my experience of working with leaders like this, what that says is we don't trust you. We don't trust you to do your work independently outside of this organization. So we're going to micromanage you. Then the pandemic occurred, and I've always said this, as tragic as it's been, it's also been a lever, an accelerated lever, to be able to have these bigger conversations about raising the consciousness of leadership and starting to look inward as well as outward. And so for me, one of the things that you mentioned, okay, now organizations are saying you've been productive at home. Now we want you back in the office. But there's no reason for that to be the case other than lack of trust and micromanaging. And that to me typifies the hypocrisy of the modern approach to leadership. It reminds me of something, call it the 3 data points, and I write about this in my book, one of my books somewhere, where I walk down the corridors of power and I see all the nice buzzwords and one-page laminate statements on the wall. We lead with integrity. We are one team. Fill in the blank. You and I have probably helped clients to develop these things, as I've talked about over the years with others. That's the first data point. Then you go into the offices of different leaders and you see the books that they read, apparently, are on their shelves, the classics in leadership. It's the second data. And then you start to see the way they actually lead when they come out into the open plan office and start to engage with them. And there's the third data. Work with hundreds of leaders, thousands indirectly across the world. And whilst they all might be very nice people, not all of them, but a lot of them are very nice people, there's an inconsistent and an incongruence between those 3 labels. Nobody really asks why. Underpinning everything I do is the ability to ask why, from a perspective of actually wanting to help raise the consciousness of leadership. not to point the blame, actually to say, why don't we create a level playing field? And why don't we talk honestly about the dark corners of the room that no one wants to shine the spotlight in? Because it's those corners in the dark parts of the room that are really going to be needed to be addressed as we go forward. Because I sense if we don't, we're going to have ongoing disengagement. Can you imagine if we had a part of Glassdoor, that website that rates employers? Imagine if we had a toxicity barometer on Glassdoor that ranked companies by the toxicity of their leadership teams. That might lead to a lot of litigation, but the point remains, very few people talk about this openly. And those that do often don't talk about it in terms of solution. It's just, this is the way it is. We've just got to accept it. No, how about evolving it? I'll pause in a moment, but I just wanted to echo that with some research that I saw recently, which actually surprised me because it was from McKinsey and it talked about, I think it was 86% of people who left organizations did so because of bad leadership. And so I then asked the question, that is an atrocious figure, of course, but I asked the next question, which very few people had asked, and that was, have we ever stopped to consider that those leaders who are considered bad leaders are also playing a part on a stage that they're either complacent to, complicit in, or they really feel that's the way they need to be as a leader in order to advance. So it shifts from one of being accusational to one of saying, why don't we take a bit of empathy here and appreciate everybody on this stage is playing a role. And I come along through my work, I say, what about if we could reframe those roles and do something differently? Because we can actually affect things if we choose to. Yeah, there's a lot in there. And I think people listening will know where they are along this continuum already.
Yeah, fascinating. There's so much to this and so much opportunity as well. It is that question around, if we run back to the familiar, how long will that last? Well, it'll last until the next disruption comes along. And then what? Then is it a repeat of the kind of meltdown of mental and emotional health that has still hanging on post-COVID? Or do we strengthen and build resilience? Do we trust that we are capable? Do we trust that we are capable individually and collectively? And do we try to really move with this flow? Because the world is not going to get less disruptive. There's all of these things going on the sideline that for the most part, I think companies are completely blind to. Look at digital transformation, which is a big word and some people just use it for marketing. But boy, the exponential tech that's sitting in the wing, that's not trivial in terms of the systemic change. If you're not aware, if you run on the old awareness, which is 3D, just what I see and feel, and if you don't tap into any kind of more dimensional instincts like sensing and intuition and some of those deeper and much more sophisticated practices, skills, attributes, traits, whatever you want to call them. If you don't tap into those, then you're really going to be left adrift when the next disruption comes down. And I feel for that because that's where people get suicidal. It's a denial virtually of all that we're capable of individually and then collectively. So I think there's some real opportunity there.
Yeah, I think there's an opportunity as well to normalize disruption. And what I mean by that is rather than say, oh, let's wait for the next disruption to come, let's just bring it into our lexicon, into our vernacular, which is we live in a disruptive world. Everything we do is disruptive. And why don't we bleed that into the language we use and the intonations and the connotations that the word evokes for us? I firmly see a future where and the research corroborates this, and those that I'm talking with corroborate this as well. And it's just that the mainstay of the population hasn't yet caught up because there's a misunderstanding of the terms that we use and why we use those terms. But I firmly see a world, Dawna, where we have adequately paired talent and leaders for identifying, cultivating, and embracing the disruptive qualities that they have. So much so that we've baked it into the way that we recruit, the way we onboard, the way we develop, the way we retain, and the way that we work. And I point back to the research I talked about earlier from the Global Innovation Index and the report that they produce every year to showcase a country's ability to be innovative relies on its ability to have disruptive talent and leaders. And you're not going to have that be normalized until we have the conversation across organizations about what do we really mean by disruption? Let's define the term. Let's define what it's not. Let's build a definition together. For instance, I was doing one of my programs last year, and one of the cohort asked a great question when I put up the 6 qualities of a disruptive leader. They said, aren't these just the qualities of a great leader? And I said, absolutely spot on, 100%. So why is it that we don't see that leader? It was almost like a Pepsi challenge test, right? A or B. And I put up these qualities and I would say, do these sound like the qualities in a leader that you'd like to have? Everybody would say yes. And then I took the blindfold away, as it were, and showed that this is what a leader who has disruptive leadership capabilities looks like. They're purpose-driven. They're motivated by the bigger picture. They build trust quickly. They're always looking for opportunities to evolve. And they bring people along with them. They're loyal. They're your biggest ambassadors. They make decisions quick, and they embrace digital assets quicker than their peers. Sounds like pretty adept leader that, if you ask me, for the future that we need. And so it's getting over that hurdle, Dawna, of like, how do we define this term? What does it evoke for us? And let's be honest about it, and let's build from there.
Do you think that the over-reliance of authority as a substitute for leadership is part of the problem? It's part of the mental block that we have toward what a leader really is, because it's tempting to confuse leadership and positions of authority versus separating those two and saying, okay, you're in a position of authority. That's one thing. That's a regulatory requirement. It may be a structural design, organizational design component, but is it necessary to, what do we do with leadership? Because leadership for an agile organization, you're really looking at leaders at every level. You're not looking at leaders in centralized positions of authority. And as such, it means, and one of the qualities, traits of a leader is doing things different. It's being different. So being, by definition, means being disruptive in these highly conforming patterns of behavior.
Yeah. Everything I've seen in leadership, everything I've experienced as a leader, everything I've researched and read in leadership tells me that we need to replace the word authority with other words like inspiring, followership. The old days of saying you're a leader because you have authority over someone else, that's gone. And organizations that cling to those outdated rhetorics, firstly, they're not the organizations of the future. That will be shown in terms of turnover levels, productivity levels, engagement levels. But secondly, the organizations that stay like that will not be able to recruit talent for the future, which will impact their overall business model as well. For me, being a great leader is someone, there's so much to this. A great leader is one who facilitates the conditions for another to be a better leader than them. There is no ego. There is no authority. There's no title. In fact, why do we still have leadership title? Again, a great leader scours the room and is looking for the people that can do better than them, because they're creating the environment for those people to shine. I think this is a leftover from outdated organizational structures that still permeate the modern enterprise. And I think we're starting to slowly see that if you leave people to themselves, i.e., if they're working in an organization and you task them with something and you empower them, then they're going to be much more productive. Morale will increase. You'll keep them longer in the organization and they'll do a really good job. If you micromanage them like a helicopter parent and just say, this is wrong, why don't you do it this way? Why haven't you done it this way? the exact opposite will happen. None of this is rocket science. And yet we still see that approach to leadership is entwined with the idea of control.
Yeah.
And so if we relinquish the need for control, ironically, we get much better outputs. I don't really engage with organizations and leaders anymore that have that approach to leadership, because philosophically, it really differs from the way that I'm honing my craft in what I'm doing. Don't want to be part of propagating a broken system anymore. I actually want to evolve the whole conversational narrative on this topic, because I think leaders who cling to the idea of authority, again, it comes back to the self-reflection piece. And why are they clinging to that? What's really motivating that? And often it's fear. Often it's ignorance, insecurity, and a feeling of not belonging somewhere. I think you would classify a leader like that as perhaps toxic. Recent research I saw, I think from Leader Factor, suggested over 90% of leaders who display those kinds of toxic behaviors are not coachable. In my head, I'm thinking we've got another epidemic coming, which is if a lot of today's leaders are toxic or display toxic symptoms, and 90% of them are not deemed to be coachable and they're not open to coaching, what do we need to do as part of regenerating the future of leadership with those leaders? How do we bring those leaders along? Do we? I think we, people like you and me and others, have a responsibility, quite frankly, a moral obligation to help raise this conversation at a global level.
Yeah, agree. And when I look at that, when I feel into people that are having a toxic impact, it's the stress and the pressure and the fear level is so high that rather than actually address it, it takes that individual down, and along with them, a whole lot of other people within their sphere of influence. The toxic side of it, it's a coping strategy and a way to protect. It's the opposite of growth. Saying yes to growth, to just stamping out modicum of trust that says, maybe I don't know everything there is to know. Maybe I don't know how to work with this, but that vulnerability that any leader should possess, but it can be avoided if you rely on your authority instead of trusting in yourself.
Yeah. And I think generally there's also a misunderstanding out there about what do we mean when we say things like vulnerability in leadership. Part of my research with developing some of my program materials, I went, because one of the qualities of the fired leader is R, that stands for real and accountable. I went through a ton of research about servant-based leadership, compassionate leadership, vulnerability, authenticity, a lot of work by Bill George, and other terms that we use basically to house in this category of like and respect leaders who show up as themselves, who are real, right? Rather than put on a mask and pretend to be something they're not. And so the terms that I've just mentioned tend to flood the world of leadership these days, since COVID especially. Harvard even did some research that showed that in the last 5 years or so, these terms have just exponentially increased in terms of now the approach to leadership is to be one of them, like vulnerable, authentic, whatever it happens to be. But very few people really know what that means. I feel that we're putting a bumper sticker on it and saying that's the latest buzzword. We don't really know what it means too much, but we'll hope that nobody questions us about how do you demonstrate vulnerability as a leader, right? Because a lot of people think it's just turning up on a Friday, playing foosball with some beanbag and having a beer with your colleague, or bringing your dog into work. It's none of that, right? That's culture. Being vulnerable as a leader is standing in a room with 10 other people on a whiteboard and saying, you're looking at me for the answer. I don't know. I'll help you. I want you to help me. Let's work this through together. That not just empowers. There's no authority there at all, right? It's just, I am one of you. We're here to do something, but we're human. In general, across the leadership industry, there's all of these terms that confuse people. I think we just need to get back to basics with what we think great leadership is and keep it simple.
I'll offer a couple of examples. First of all, one of the recent episodes on the podcast is with Gary Turner. We talk about the power of vulnerability because he went through this, and I encourage listeners to go there. But I also want to share, I facilitated for a period of time a lot of construction work. Yeah. And that's an industry that can be really rough. Not a lot of emotional maturity. There's a lot of tough stuff going on, and honestly, not a lot of elevated thinking. However, in one of the projects that I didn't facilitate, but I knew about, there was a situation where a bridge got taken out about a year or two earlier than it was supposed to be taken out. What do? You've got traffic coming over. The key point of this is that it was a mess and everybody sorted it out very quickly. That's the benefit of partnering and people working together cooperatively instead of reading the contract and saying, you have to do that. So they worked together to solve the problem. The construction company head walked in and said, I've screwed up. Here's what's happened. I need everybody to work. And then that level of vulnerability, it's honesty in that case. It's just, here we are. And I can't fix it myself. We're going to need to work together. That was brilliant. So much respect for someone that can step forward and say, here's the reality of the situation. And now we need to work. That was brilliant. It was unforgettable because I stopped doing that work, I don't know, 15 years. I may not remember the precise scenario, but I do remember the action, which was to step up and say, look, I messed up here and I'm going to need your help to fix it.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of the case studies I put in my book. I think it's under the real and accountable chapter. And I talk about a guy called Nick Starillo. He's a public figure. He ran a chain of pizzerias in Chicago, I believe. And they were opening up quite a lot of stores. I think this was their second store or third store that they were opening up. They prematurely opened it. And so they couldn't afford to do payroll. They couldn't afford to stay open. And against the advice of his bank and shareholders and other well-meaning and well-intentioned people, Nick decided to write an open letter that he sent to all staff across the organization. And basically said, I own this because I wanted to expand our operations too quickly. And so we are in a situation where if we don't generate revenue in the next number of days or number of months, we're going to go out of business. He did that against the advice of everyone around him who were his advisors. And what that resulted in was not just absolute support from his staff. The organization was able to survive because of that act of good. Being open and vulnerable led to more acts of people being vulnerable and demonstrating goodwill. And so the store stayed open, expanded, and has been successful ever since. I use that just to illustrate the point of being vulnerable, because a lot of people assume that being vulnerable is a weakness. I'm firmly convinced it's a superpower. I know Gary Turner quite well. I've been on his one or two of his podcasts and talked with him about what we do. So he's a great advocate of this work, not just in this area of work, but his own stories as well from his own life. But ability is definition of what future leaders need to have. They need to be able to embrace that side of themselves. In fact, I said this about leaders not wearing masks to work. We show up as our complete authentic selves, not one person at home and another at the office. And that concept is becoming even more needed now, especially in a post-pandemic world where we don't have all the answers and we've put our neck on the line to be vulnerable, to work together to find answers. I said, it's a very important conversation. And I think just by having the conversation, more and more people are able to demonstrate what it really means to be vulnerable.
The bridge incident happened because the wrong bridge was taken down, for example. And it's a disruptive event. It was unexpected, was not what was planned. And yet that individual's response made the difference. Any kind of disruptive event that goes against, you could look at it as a really big mistake and run around and find somebody to blame. But that's the opposite, A, of leadership, and B, of anything productive. Turn those moments into something bigger, more valuable. And that's, I think, one of the best examples of how to use disruption to advance not only leadership, but to advance the awareness and the consciousness of the entire project, organization, whatever level scale that you're working at.
It reminded me of someone that endorsed my book, actually, was the former CEO of WD-40, Gary Ridge.
Right.
And he talks about learning moments, mistakes, errors, whatever you want to call them, are typically seen through the lens of you did something wrong and there are repercussions, as opposed to look at the opportunity to learn within that actual event itself. The organization and our approach to leadership is characterized by so many of these learning moments. If we embrace those learning moments, that's the glue that binds our leaders and our organizations together, because that is what engenders loyalty. When we can talk about these things and turn them into something as a go forward that we'll do differently or learn from.
Right. I want to circle back to the value. One part of the value of disruption is to change how you respond and react. That's a big element of it. Another is when I was working on Decision Making for Dummies in 2014, a consultant of the United States called me up and said, I want to talk to you. I hear you're working on this. I want to talk to you. So we met in a cafe and just chatted about his thousands of hours consulting, walking into organizations. And I'll never forget it, because he said to me, in the first 15 minutes of walking into an organization, I know what they're going to do next, because he could spot the patterns, easily spot the patterns. After all that experience of going in and watching how people think, the thinking was predictable. So it was just a matter of experience before you start recognizing what these patterns are made of. That's one of the biggest values of disruption, is it just shakes those patterns up and allows the company to grow instead of running around in circles. Running around in circles is that recycling of the past, versus you get a disruption and you go, oh, how can we use this? How can we grow through this? And I'm not sure that companies took as much advantage of the pandemic as they could have, but that's certainly the value of any kind of disruption, whether it's disruptive thinking or an event that breaks up those patterns, allows for reflection and a bit of retrospection, then you're seizing the moment.
Wouldn't it be interesting if we could provide organizations with some type of blueprint as part of disruption? Here's what typically happens.
Yeah.
Forget the actual disruptive event itself for a moment, but there are generally patterns that occur, so much so that you could create a blueprint that help leaders to navigate the disruptive event using these kind of gateways, if you like. These gateways would have a set of activities that you could conduct. It's all part of this process of normalizing disruption, normalizing our approach to disruptive leadership. And when we think about preparing organizations for ongoing disruptions, I talk about this concept of almost like a disruptive leadership lab, basically getting a bunch of leaders into a lab, an experimental lab, and getting them to apply the different qualities that leaders with these capabilities have to whatever the initiative is, to whatever they're trying to solve. And always have two groups. One group that you push through as a cohort who apply these capabilities in this lab and get them monitored and reviewed and see what's coming out from that in terms of progress and data points and ROI. And then have another cohort that doesn't go through this kind of lab and just see what happens. This is what I did as one possible practical activity to organizations when they're teetering on the edge of seeing the value and the role and the impact that leaders who have disruptive capabilities can bring. I invite them to do that, because those are the leaders that, if embraced through this context, are going to be able to navigate through these patterns, navigate through this blueprint. When I think about the future organizational structure, I'm seeing very much leaders who have the insights, bring them into the fold, make them part of the fabric of the organization and its growth, and support them with systems and processes as well.
Yeah.
If we don't, my fear is that we'll continue to see patterns and not be able to navigate those patterns.
Yeah. And similarly, run backwards instead of forwards when a disruption hits. Run back to certainty instead of using the uncertainty for growth. I think that's the other dimension of that for sure.
The other ebook I pulled out recently about disruptive leadership made it very clear that it is this kind of leadership capability that we will need for continued growth.
Right.
And the ability to disrupt. I have a simple formula that I created that I teach as part of my work, which is innovation comes from disruption. Disruption comes from our ability to create the environment for disruptive thinking. But in order to have disruptive thinking, you've got to create the conditions to think and dare to think and act differently. I call that fresh thinking, which is the F in my FIRE book. Fresh thinking is the beginning of it all. Right. You can chart that all the way through the stages then and show categorically if you don't create the environment whereby it's celebrated, if your talent, your leaders are daring to think and act differently, you won't get them thinking disruptively. You won't have disruption as a result of that, and you won't continue to innovate in whatever industry your organization serves. So simple as a formula, as a tool. What underpins it all is the ability to have conversations with organizations about breaking down those myths, those stigmas that they have that surround these words. But again, you might have heard of the adage that you can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink.
Yeah,
So
heard of.
all we are is the stewards, bringing a piece of information to someone. It's up to them what they do with it.
Yeah, I'd like to talk about another quieter level of disruption, if you will. That is the role of sensitivity. Certainly the younger generations come in with a higher level of sensitivity. The older generations have been on stress leave. They have a high level of sensitivity. They haven't been able to function in a regular workplace because they're too noisy. And if they're toxic, forget it. The capacity for sensing is one of those things that, as Rita McGrath says, allows you to see around corners. This is an attribute. The opportunity then is to embrace something other than thinking everything runs through the intellectual zone, the mental zone, and you're recognizing and respecting the role of sensing, which is an intuitive quality as well, the role of sensing in creating an understanding of what's coming ahead, in creating an understanding of what's running underneath the disruption. What are the opportunities? What are the patterns holding things in place? A whole range of valuable benefits that come through this. When you look at disruptive leadership, what do you think is the role of sensing?
It's interesting because it's almost like an oxymoron. The fact that you wouldn't put in the linear levels thinking mind, you wouldn't put the ability to sense at a deeper level with the word disruptive, right? The irony is not lost on me. And that's why when I did the research around leaders who have disruptive leadership capability, I've looked at a number of different sources and they all point towards leaders who have this capability as being extremely perceptive, being able to build trust quickly, to creating the conditions for honest conversation. This conversation that we're having now, the ability of these leaders to genuinely tap in to what's motivating their peers, people around them, and then use that with the individual to empower them. You are already at a different level of leadership. I then asked the question, which I pretty much answered in my head already, but if that's the leader of the future that we need, that kind of leader, and we know our systems and processes aren't ready and aren't geared up to accommodating them, the bigger thing for me is almost the business model that organizations use. Typically, being in a leadership position, you've got to get stuff done because at the end of the day, there's an output. whether or not that output gets met determines the overall success at a financial level of the organization. Now, there are organizations whose purpose is more driven by impact on the environment, the ability to create a legacy in what they're doing, and finance is secondary. But the modern day corporation is structured in law as we speak to generate a return for its shareholders, typically, which means everything needs to be geared towards making that organization profitable. As we start to embrace a new kind of leadership quality, when I say that, I'm including the ability to sense at that intuitive level. One of the questions I ask myself, is that at odds with the current business model and the current legal obligation of the modern day corporation? I was looking at the idea of curiosity, and Professor Francesca Gino from Harvard wrote a great book called Rebel Talent. And she leveraged some research. She did some research, and she wanted to find out the true value of curiosity in organizations, because curiosity drives a different way of thinking, asking questions, generating disruption, resulting in innovation. And she surveyed over 500 chief learning officers who, I think most of them valued the idea of curiosity in their leaders. And yet there was a high number who discouraged it when it came down to actually putting a commitment to embracing this curiosity, because it costs too much money. What they meant by that was, if you encourage people to be curious and try new ideas, not all of them are going to stick. Some of them will, some of them won't. And the idea was that costs too much money, because while exploring that way, the work of doing the work to deliver the outputs that I mentioned earlier in the traditional business model are not getting done. And so there's a bit of or is there a balance? It's interesting to see the trends are clearly showing that human-centered, heart-centered, different kinds of leadership, whatever we want to call it, are needed. And I wonder, and I worry sometimes, whether our approach to the way we structure organizations is keeping up or not. Right? The work of Frederick Laloux, a lot of his work is based upon Ken Wilber's work. Every stage of an organization's evolution, if our human consciousness doesn't evolve at the same pace, then that organization will be at odds with the talent base, because philosophically it's not keeping up with what people expect. My concern is that when we talk about sensing and curiosity and all those kind of traits, that might be the case as well. There's an education piece, which is to introduce the value, that the ability to, quite frankly, the ability to motivate others by being deeply intuitive is something you can't teach unless you think you can teach it. I think there's some that think you can teach things like emotional intelligence. And I think there's just an intuition that you have with certain people that they're operating on a different dimension. I'm curious about how that's perceived in the workplace and how it will be perceived by the decision makers that have responsibility for ultimately presenting their financial results at the end of the year to shareholders.
I truly find it fascinating, because sensing is basically how big changes take place, direction shifts, it's reading the environment. And what I hear from that, it's too expensive. It's the consciousness of either, and if you stick an and in there in the middle instead of an either or, you have a direction that takes it to the next level. It's not either or, it's not either this or that. It is an and that's more of a unifying approach. The idea that these things end up being more expensive is like saying we don't really want to know what's coming down the pipe, because it might be too expensive to think about that. We'd rather deal with it when it hits. And the example I always use, I don't know if you ever watched the animation film, Pixar animation, The Incredibles, but there's a character called Edna Mode, and she designs super suits for the superheroes, which I love that. But she says, fortune favors the prepared. That's really what sensing does. And we all do it. We're all sensors. Some of us have more than others. more amplified, but we all do it. That's how we navigate from one environment to the next. It's a fascinating contradiction, if you will, of what that role is, that trait. It is an incredibly valuable part of using diverse points of view, using diverse traits, skills for moving through different conditions, for seeing them coming and moving through different conditions.
Yeah, it's a very uncomfortable conversation for most organizations to have, because they do come into that contradiction that we just talked about. It's getting past that hurdle in a way that almost speaks the language of tangibilities with someone that's in an organization who wants output, who wants results. How do we marry those terms together? Often we're unable to, although we feel it when we know that we've motivated a peer and they've gone on to stay in the organization, they've gone on to do great work. And maybe they've done that because they felt heard, they felt seen, and the ability to sense where someone is energetically results in that.
Yeah.
And it's not something that you can put a leader on as part of a new onboarding program where, let's be honest, HR typically are wanting to push people through and tick the box around immersing new talent into an organization. And those kinds of programs are quite pioneering in the sense that they are different and they're foraging new ground. How do we normalize that in the workplace?
Yeah, those are all good questions that have a variety of answers, because it's going to be a yes and approach. If the focus is super narrow and super high pressure, you're just going to want to keep doing what you've always done and leave yourself exposed, because there's no adaptive capacity in rigidity. You really have to be willing to try something else and be willing to experiment. I'm thinking back to the book that Chris Matz and a colleague of his wrote called The Commitment, where they're coming down to the decision, but you keep your options open because the conditions are dynamic. And at some point you commit. If you commit too early and other opportunities come up, then it's going to be a very expensive re-engineering of the process or the decision or whatever the implications are. But if you come at it with a more open mind to observing and sensing what's coming in, then you can make a better decision in the end. It's that sense of, what direction are we going to take here? This direction or that direction? How do you make that decision? Do you run that through your cognitive computer? Do you run it through AI and get a bunch of scenarios? And do you tap into that sensibility of what's going to work here in the longer run, based on your experience, based on variables?
You just reminded me of a book I read many years ago, actually, but around concept of change management. I've done a lot of work in that area in my career. One of the things that I've always sensed was that just applying a methodology doesn't work when you're taking someone through from A to B and shifting the way they look at their work, do their work, feel about their work. And so this concept of viral change is actually, I believe that's the book. It's called Viral Change. And it talks about the fact that that's where real change occurs. It's by the water cooler. It's that ability to relate to humans at a human level, get them to be vulnerable, to share how you're feeling about the change, and to also be reaffirmed and reinforced by someone else's reaction. Say, hey, this isn't too bad. This is what we were expecting. This is what's happened. This is how the process works. Whereas I think a more traditional approach to change is to take people through a step-by-step methodology framework, which doesn't work because it doesn't accommodate and allow and embrace what we're talking about here, which is human feeling. But it makes me question, how prepared are our organizations for even creating the conditions to have this kind of conversation? That's what really intrigues me, is how do you get in front of an organization to have this conversation?
Yeah. To me, this is about the fractal aspect of emotional health, at the personal level, emotional health at the organizational level. They're not able to have these conversations unless they're committed to being a healthy organization. If they're being a healthy organization, then they can have these conversations because you will wade your way through. You have to time it and pace it. There's a cadence you'll want based on how quickly, on how adaptive the company can be. But that to me is central to being able to have these conversations, because if you can't do that, then you're stuck in that rut of recycling the past.
I'd be interested in actually really understanding how many healthy organizations are there out there.
Yeah, I would love to have a little.
This is, yeah, some kind of assessment tool to determine that, or some kind of inside track, because the Glassdoors and the other accolades of employers of choice and all of these top 50 companies, they all provide on the surface what seems to be very positive reviews of organizations and what it's like to work in them. But we both probably know of stories from people in those organizations that say the exact opposite. So again, we come back to this concept of the hypocrisy of the conversation. Yeah, because organizations don't like to air their dirty linen in public. So I would be fascinated to find out, how do we actually measure an organization to determine if it's healthy?
One of the dimensions to that is what you just said, which is how well does an organization take conflict, internal conflict, and use it creatively to become better as an organization, as a workplace, and as a contributor to the economic engine. It's one of the factors. And a lot of, to even be talking about toxic workplaces right away, they're out.
Mm-hmm.
They have been unable to use that kind of conflict and tension in a productive and constructive or creative way. They're just letting it eat people up. And that's not a healthy thing. I think this is another deeper conversation that we could go into. I'm just wondering if there's anything else we could or need to talk about, or do you feel, because we can pick this up again in another time. Yeah. How do you feel about the conversation of disruptive leadership today in our episode today?
I've enjoyed this conversation. And I do think that it permeates everything we're talking about, which is different ways of approaching the future, whether that's embracing a different kind of leader, a different kind of thinker. Are our structures and systems and processes ready to adapt to the future? Every conversation I have and every strain of a conversation where it goes down is all about, how do we help the organizations of the future to be better? And how do we equip them to be better? A lot of people can talk about these kinds of concepts without ever really adding any value in terms of, well, how do you help an organization that going through this transition, or painfully doesn't want to go through it but needs to, or those that are ready and they're willing but they need a guide? Conversations like this where it gets a bit deeper, and I'm also talking on podcasts that are very short and to the point, but I really like conversations where you can get under the covers and have real meaty topic that people, we can leave them with something better so that they can try in their organization. I think that's what it's all about. It's about having a conversation, listening to what resonates, and then adapting it to the organization that you're in. So I enjoy this. I like that. The one thing I pick up on from your last point about conflict with teams, with organizations, is some of the work that I do with leadership teams around conflict. I've used the Thomas Gilman approach to conflict. The idea of that model is that we want to get people to a collaborative space. So we see conflict as actually a necessary and a positive in the organization and in the approach to how teams work together, especially leadership teams. Because I think all too often there's a competitive angle where someone wants to compete to be heard over someone else. But to get team productive and working to achieving the bigger picture, bigger purpose of the organization, it's about creating those conditions. How do we collaborate on something? How do we take the best of your ideas, the best of my ideas, and find another idea? I think that also comes back to the way that we perceive certain terms in organizations. We tend to understand the word conflict to be a negative. What about if that's just part of how an organization, how a team evolves?
Absolutely. It is part of how an organization evolves. And if you cannot step into it with a curiosity and an openness to learning from it, I don't think you can work with diversity. You can't work with diverse points of view. You can't work with different of opinions because you're too busy trying to get them to conform and resolve it. I have a peeve against all these conflict resolution programs, which I took because I was normally facilitating really tough stuff. But it was just that whole business. We got to resolve it. Why don't we work with this powerful energy? We work with it in a more constructive way. And when you do that, then you develop skills. The other element of it for me is that out of working with that kind of tension and that sort of energy comes a sense of belonging because you've tackled it together. If you don't have a sense of belonging, if you don't have that glue, you have no resilience. You're just not going to be able to bounce back from setbacks because you haven't invested the time to use those tensions and conflicts for growth. You're in protection mode 100%.
One of my clients about 18 months ago actually was in a similar situation where they were a senior leadership team and they were not working well together at all. And I worked with a team to create the environment so that we could have a coaching environment. So we would hear from how do you create the environment to have a challenging conversation? And we put in place kind of loose ground rules for engaging. And the idea was to get them to surface the most pressing three most difficult areas that they had with their respective peers. Then we would use almost a rating criteria to determine, okay, which three are we going to talk about now in the room? But what it did was actually brought them closer together as a team. This particular client, their team was on the verge of disbanding. And so it was really at that point. But it was about perspective and the perception that one took about challenging conversations. Rather than thinking, this isn't going to go anywhere, the philosophy was very much, what can we learn from one another as we go through these challenging conversations? And those learning points, again, back to what I mentioned earlier about Gary Ridge's learning moments in an organization, they became the glue. They did become the glue that bound that team together. And then as a result, their behavior shifted, their work outputs improved, their productivity improved. And all of a sudden they were being asked, what did you do to address your challenges? Really, it was just creating the environment to have honest conversation. There's one message to leave anyone listening to this with. It's really, because we talked about a lot of things, I think, but it's really, how do we create conditions to have honest conversations?
Yeah.
And what's our role in that? How do we play a role in creating the conditions? Because I firmly believe that without true honesty in an organization, we are not maximizing the role of everybody in our organization.
I completely agree. In this conversation, we've given a whole lot of practices that people can put to play if they want to, a lot of ways of seeing things, lenses to use when looking at the current situation, either in yourself or in the company. Anything in particular you'd like to add for someone who's a disruptive leader or for someone who's been in the past rejected?
Yeah, I think one of the things I invite people to do is almost do some kind of mini audit of their leadership culture. And what I mean by that is look around your leadership pool, the leaders that you work with, what's working, what isn't working, what isn't being talked about. And I encourage people to collect data on that and then have conversations, almost like conversation cafes with leaders, to really get to the heart of what is the leadership culture really like. So that's the first thing I would do. I would also ask organizations to conduct some type of assessment into how much have they spent, like physical money, on developing their leaders, and how effective has that leadership development been? Because I'd really like organizations to localize this to their own experience, to make it real for them. Because you can see in dollars and cents okay, we've invested this much money. This is the output. Like, how effective is this being? Doing that, and the previous thing I suggested gets people, almost starts waking them up. So they're now aware, they're awakened to, okay, what is the state of leadership in my organization right now? Without doing that, Donna, there's no other conversation that I would suggest to have with an organization, because they've got to know where the baseline is. That I could come into organizations and say, you need these leadership capabilities. This is how we can introduce them. But until the organization itself has done the work to determine the business case for that, they've got to understand what's in their own backyard. And so for me, I always encourage organizations to do that upfront piece of work, which requires reflection, which requires the ability to look honestly in the mirror. If someone's listening to this and they're in the twilight of their career and they just care about moving off with a legacy intact, then they might not be the kind of person that would do this work anyway. If they're driven by a bigger picture and want to really evoke change in what they're doing, and they're looking at helping onboard the next generation of leaders, there might be a different conversation. So I would suggest those two things initially.
Excellent. And I would add, get some distance from your own culture. People go off on these leadership things and they come back into a culture that doesn't want leaders. They want performers. How do the systems and processes shape the expression of leadership in the environment you're in? I think that's an important question, because if you can't answer, or at least put the question forward and reflect on it, then I'm not sure that you can go anywhere, because you can provide people with all the tools. But if your systems and processes internally are designed to conform and push them back and get rid of those dissenting voices or disruptive sounds, then you're not going to make it.
Yeah, that's a good point. It reminds me of something I included in my book, The Fired Leader, which actually was similar to that. But I asked people to, because we know that when we talk about exit interviews, when people leave and there's a notional exit interview, I've yet to meet any organization that does them well, or actually does anything meaningful with the data that's collected from those types of exit interviews. One of the things I suggest in a roadmap that I give away, actually, it's a companion guide to the book, and people can go on my website and download it for free. It's about $3 million of consulting work that I just give away end to end, because I want to get this work into as many hands as possible. One of the activities in there is I say, look, why don't you take a sample of leaders at different levels who've left your organization, involuntarily or voluntarily, and go and ask them why they left. Ask them why they truly left. Obviously, if you're in a case of litigation with them, perhaps not a good idea at the moment. But even then, again, an approach to this, looking at this through that way, could actually yield some interesting data. But I always ask people to think about what they get back from those interactions and use that to help shape future conversations about how you identify, recruit, and onboard leaders. Because that's where the answers lie. And so that's another thing I would suggest. That takes a lot of reflection. That takes the ability to drop the facade and perhaps drop the approach to being ego-driven as well. So
I totally agree. I've seen some of those exit experience. I have had a real job. I want to know a long time. I've seen the line of questioning. You think there's no room in there for an honest answer. You're just looking for me to tick the boxes. And when you're looking for that, you're not really sincere about doing. I've heard people say, yeah, I just gave them what they needed. I'm not going to give them the real reason. They're not really that interested. But it speaks to the intention. Are we really using these as a tick the box, or are we really using them because we plan to learn from that? We want to learn. We are genuine and sincere about learning from these exits.
Yeah, and just one final thing, just to solidify and cement some of this conversation that we've had. I think it's quite odd to me that and I put a post out on LinkedIn about this a few weeks ago. It's quite odd to me that we celebrate such a vast range of disruptive technologies that have been introduced to us. The iPhone, the internet, Uber, Airbnb, the list goes on. And yet, when it comes to the leaders, the people that created that disruptive technology, we tend to stigmatize and marginalize the leaders who brought us these technologies because of their disruptive leadership capability. And I put in my book as well, most of us have heard of the Lenovo ThinkPad, and the red dot in the middle, the actual mouse, that was created by a guy called Ted Salker. Ted Salker was almost fired when he brought that idea to his boss because it upstaged his boss, because his boss had another idea. Fortunately, in this case, there was a happy ending because Ted and his boss were able to create the environment to have conversations that they need to, and the boss embraced the idea, and the rest is history because the Lenovo ThinkPad, I think, went on and quadrupled its sales to the nearest competitor because of that one distinct feature. I use that example to showcase a few things. I think one is that fresh thinking can lead to complete innovation at a global level. And also that I don't want to paint a picture that leaders who have and talent who have disruptive leadership capabilities are never embraced in organizations. They are. It can be a slow process, and you can see the results of when they are. But unfortunately, the vast majority of organizations, there is that contradiction there. We embrace disruptive technologies, yet marginalize those who brought us those technologies.
Post notes are a good example. It took 10 years for that one to come out of the closet. That's a long time. And if we were working, I'm sorry, that's just not good enough. Yeah, just not good enough. Paul, I want to thank you so much for this lovely time. Just to kick stuff around and riff on it and explore. And so I'm sure we'll do it again. Webinar format, but yeah, thank you.
I like these riffs because we can go anywhere. And I think there's so many nuggets of stuff in here that would be useful to people. If they are useful, then I'd love to hear what resonated with people. I've really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you. In the show notes, we'll put the links. And thanks again for being on the program.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Research from neuroscience tells us that the brain loves to follow patterns because that's knowing you're safe. So it is the novelty, it is the uncertainty that wakes your attention, whether it's in yourself as an individual or in a company experiencing a disruption, whether you're aware of it or not. Andrew Huberman, who has probably one of the most popular podcasts in the world, says focus attention on learning, even if it requires strain and confusion. In other words, it's going to be uncomfortable. Just accept that. That's the way it is. So focus attention on learning, even if it requires strain and confusion, followed by rest periods for the actual rewiring to occur. Those are non-negotiable ingredients. Dr. Andrew Huberman at Stanford, how it fits with disruptive leadership is that disruption is sometimes uncomfortable. You're going to feel that. You're going to notice that someone's just challenged your worldview. And it might make you angry at first or a little irritated, and you want to get rid of the person because that's the fastest thing to do. However, if you allow yourself to be disrupted, if you allow yourself to move through that confusion and to allow things to come in, then you're going to be far better equipped to handle any kind of surprise, far more ready to adapt more quickly because you're training yourself to be adaptive. That makes sense? So I want to thank you very much for joining me on this program. I hope you've enjoyed it. My name is Donna Jones. You can find me on all of the places in the show notes. Mostly, though, you will find me on LinkedIn. I publish both on Substack and LinkedIn. I'm also doing some writing work on Medium. Look for me there and or join the mailing list. Subscribe here, provide a review, anything you can to help continue this work, preparing people for massive changes so that you can move through it smoothly, with trust, and with confidence. Thanks for joining me.